Hey, what's going on everybody? It's etaprime back here again. Today we're going to be taking a look at the all-new ONEX Player 1S. Now, we have taken a look at the original version of the ONEX Player on the channel, and that was powered by the Intel 1165G7. This one here is coming in with a more powerful Tiger Lake CPU, being the 1195G7. We have a max turbo clock on the CPU up to 5 GHz, and the built-in Intel Iris graphics actually runs at 1400 MHz instead of 1300. As you can see, for a handheld, this thing is pretty massive because it actually packs an 8.4-inch IPS display with a resolution of 2560 by 1600. So when it came to the original ONEX Player, I was actually a big fan of it. I do love this bigger screen, and if you have smaller hands, this can be a massive handheld. But when it comes down to it, I personally don't like playing on a smaller screen. I think this 8.4-inch screen is great, but they did go a little overkill on the resolution. So over here on the left-hand side, as you can see, we have our analog stick and a pretty decent D-pad. There's a desktop button that'll bring us right back to the desktop. We also have our select and our start button, and this is more set up like the Xbox controller. And if we take a look at these two buttons, we have a keyboard button and a turbo button. Right out of the box, this is running at 20 watts, at least the 1195G7 version. But at any time, we can hit that turbo button, and it's going to bring the TDP up to 28 watts. Around back here, we have our volume control up and down. We also have a dedicated mute button, our power button / fingerprint reader button, and this does come with a built-in kickstand. This definitely comes in handy if you want to kind of play this in tabletop mode, but it does have HDMI out over USB. Here's a closer look at the left-hand side button layout. We also have front-firing stereo speakers built into the ONEX Player. The turbo button and the keyboard button do come in really handy. Like I mentioned, turbo button ups the TDP on the CPU, giving you more performance out of this handheld, and the keyboard button can be pressed once to bring up an on-screen keyboard, or it can be held for 3 seconds and it'll actually turn the built-in controller into a mouse. You're going to use that left analog stick to navigate with your mouse cursor. It does have built-in shoulder buttons and triggers, and when it comes to the triggers, these are linear, so they're analog, and you can pull them a little bit to get a bit of action out of it while you're playing a game, or pull it all the way down and it'll do 100% pull. So when it comes to the specs of the ONEX model, for the CPU we have the Intel i7 1195G7. 4 cores, 8 threads, base clock of 2.9 GHz, and a max turbo clock up to 5 GHz. For the GPU, we have Intel Iris Xe graphics. This is the 96 execution unit, up to 1400 MHz, 16 GB of LPDDR4X RAM running at 4266 MHz. As for storage, you can opt for a 512 GB model or a 1 TB model. It uses an NVMe M.2 SSD, and this is user replaceable if you wanted to get in there. It's got a built-in 59 watt-hour battery. It does support 45 watt quick charging, and battery life will depend on what kind of TDP you have the CPU set at and what you're really doing. When it comes to gaming, at 20 watts, you can get around 3 hours of battery life. If you just want to do some video streaming and things like that, you can get 7 to 8. But once you take the TDP up on this thing, especially with the 1195G7, you can expect around an hour and a half of gameplay out of this thing. Alright, so real quick, I just want to show you this turbo button. Here we have Overwatch running, 1080p, medium settings, and I'm just going to face this wall over here. We're around 103 to 107 FPS. As soon as I turn that turbo on, you can see it jump on up to around 120 FPS. It definitely makes a difference, and in certain games it makes a huge difference, but remember, it's going to draw more power and produce more heat, so if you don't need that turbo on for the game you're playing, I would definitely leave it off. Here's one more. We have Doom Eternal. You can see that FPS. We're at 20 watts. Turbo's on. Jumped on up to around 67 to 68 FPS, and our CPU is now running at close to 30 watts. You can turn it right back off, turn it right back on. We will be testing out some PC games and emulation in this video, but the first thing I did was run a few benchmarks. I wanted to check this 1195G7 out. First on the list, Geekbench 5, single core, 1606, multi, 5648. That single core is looking really good for a mobile chip. Moving over to some GPU benchmarks with 3D Mark Night Raid, 17,601, Firestrike, 5,202, and finally, Time Spy with a 1,937. Not bad at all, and when I compare this to mobile Ryzen chips with the built-in Vega graphics, we are scoring a bit higher here. Moving over to some PC gaming, first up we have The Witcher 3 with a medium-low mix, and I will admit most of these are set to low, but we're at 900p and it actually surprised me. It did way better than I thought it would. With the settings I used, I got an average of 64 FPS out of this game. Now I completely understand that this is a handheld, but what I'm going to do is actually plug this into my game capture just to make it a little easier on me and easier for you to see. Next on the list, we have Forza Horizon 4, 900p with a medium-low mix. By the end of this run, I had an average of 72 FPS. Now, if you go to the lowest settings, we can do this pretty good at 1080p, but I did want to mix it up a bit with a couple mediums thrown in there. The 1195 G7 actually handled GTA 5 really well. Here it is at 900p with a normal high mix. We got an average of 74 FPS. Still a huge fan of Skyrim, so I wanted to test it out. Original Skyrim, 1080p, high settings, it's going to run at 60 all day. It did a really good job here, and I'm actually not using the turbo mode here. We're only at 20 watts. Overwatch, 1080p, medium settings, we got an average of 97 FPS. And finally, for PC gaming, at least for this video, we have CYberpunk 2077. 720p, low, 100% resolution scale, we got an average of 34 FPS. Not ideal by any means, but you could drop that resolution scale down and get a bit more out of it. Now it's time to move over to some emulation. This is really my favorite part about these handhelds, and first up we have PS2 using PCSX2, Gran Turismo 4, DirectX 11 back-end, 1440p, so we're at a 2K resolution with this, and every once in a while I do notice a couple strange dips. It did go down to 55, but it didn't really feel like it was going down to 55. It immediately jumped right back up, and it's really doing a great job here at 1440, and if you just want to eliminate any of these dips at all, go to 1080, it's going to run great. WiiU using the CEMU emulator, Breath of the Wild. Turbo button is totally turned off. We're only at 20 watts. This is at the native 720p resolution. We're at 30 FPS and it's running great. Using the Vulkan backend here, and I really do have to give it to the CEMU developers. They've done an amazing job optimizing this for these Intel integrated graphics. And finally, we have PS3 using RPCS3, Skate 3, Vulkan backend, native 720p resolution. It's trying its hardest to keep it 60, and we do get a few dips here and there, but overall, it's trucking through this pretty well. And keep in mind, Skate 3 is one of the harder ones to emulate, along with God of War 3, but there are some games that just work really well with this emulator on a lot of hardware, like Demon's Souls and Tekken 6. So it is a bit of an upgrade over the 1165 G7 version, but not by much, and it really comes down to the thermals. Now we can run this at 28 watts, but at 28 watts with an extreme load on that CPU, it will thermal throttle. While I was running 3D Mark Time Spy at the CPU portion of the test, it did thermal throttle, so that score there is actually a little limited because it wasn't reaching its maximum clock speeds. And another test I ran was through Forza Horizon 4 at 1080p medium settings. At 28 watts, this can reach over 60 FPS, but it hits that throttle really quickly and drops on back down because again, that CPU has to limit itself so it doesn't overheat and burn up. I did pull the back off of this just to see if I could easily get to the CPU cooler and replace the thermal paste, but there's a lot that I need to disassemble to get to it, and if we take a look here, we don't see the M.2. It's actually buried under the heat shroud, so there is a lot that you need to take out of here to upgrade that M.2 SSD and change that thermal paste out. I'm sure it would help out a little bit, but I still think we could hit that thermal throttle with this 1195 G7. In my next video that I do on this, I will have this completely done and I'll do a little bit of a comparison for you. The USB-C ports on the ONEX Player are USB 4.0 and it does support Thunderbolt 4, so we can add an eGPU to this quite easily. And if that's something you're interested in seeing, just let me know in the comments below and I can do a video on that. So yeah, I mean, that's going to wrap it up for my first video on the ONEX Player 1S. I will have a couple more coming, so keep an eye on the channel. I'll do a full emulation video. We'll test out about 10 more PC games. And like I said, if you're interested in seeing an eGPU connected to this, just let me know in the comments below. If you're interested in learning more about the ONEX Player 1S, I'll leave a few links in the description. But that's going to wrap it up for this one. And like always, thanks for watching.